There's 4 basic ingredients in beer, and barley malt is one of them. Brett, where does Urban Artifact get their malt?
Well, Mike, that's a great question because I thought you were going to ask me what the other 3 ingredients in beer were, and I was prepared to say flesh, blood, and bone.
That one comes out in October.
But when I'm buying my malt, I buy from Malt Europe because they make the best quality malt at the best possible price. Some of the best breweries in the world use Malt Europe, and I am proud to say that Urban Artifact is one of those breweries.
Do you have to be a commercial brewery to use Malt Europe malt?
You don't. You can head down to your local homebrew store and you can find a wide selection of Malt Europe malts there. So if you're a pro brewer or a home brewer alike, get the best value, the best product at the best price. Get Malt Europe.
And they support us. So Prost.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to another episode of the Brew Skies Happy Hour podcast. My name is Brett Coleman Baker, owner and brewer at Urban Artifact in Cincinnati, Ohio, and I am here today with Michael Morgan, the one and only, I might add. Mike, how the hell are you?
It's Friday and I'm doing fantastic.
You know, this is a pretty good Friday, I'd have to say.
They're pretty good in general.
Yeah,
Not that it really always matters to me. I mean, I often have a lot of miserable stuff I have to do on Saturday or over the weekend, but just the concept of it. I mean, Friday is kind of like a religion to me. You know, you start drinking. I mean,
Time to go to church.
yeah.
And the church is the bar.
It's my equivalent.
And my sacrament is 20 beers.
Yeah. Yeah. I sometimes pay penance on a Saturday morning.
Sometimes self-flagellation is the only way to achieve true enlightenment. So I
Yeah.
understand.
I mean, thank God at this point in this age, I don't say all of those Hail Marys in front of the porcelain god the way that I used to. I think they sounded a lot more like Ralph, too. But nevertheless, still, Friday, it kicks ass. So happy Friday, man. Cheers.
Happy frickin' Friday. In today's episode, we are going to be talking about the impact that advertising had on the brewing industry. And it wasn't necessarily a positive impact. In fact, you could probably argue, as a consumer, it was a negative impact.
Because it's not just that advertising changed, it's that the primary driver of change in the industry was advertising. It was the tail wagging the dog. Just the advertising transformed the industry, decreased your options as a drinker, further consolidated it, and dumbed down beer.
Specifically, we're going to talk about the period post-Prohibition through about 1970, early 1970s.
Which is when things get really weird, and then we'll talk about that in the next episode.
Yes. As I'm sure if you're listening, you probably remember 1980s, 1990s beer advertising. It was something else.
And we'll get to really all the evil things that it did, but I will say that what does make me happy, going back and looking at some of these beer ads, Brett, they were funny, man. Do you remember when commercials were about something other than a bunch of diseases that were just a string of letters that can be cured by some pill made by Pfizer or the Sackler family? I mean, commercials used to be fun, man.
Well, not to go on a complete diatribe here, but why doesn't diabetes have a spokesperson anymore? Where's Wilford Brimley when you need him? Remember when diseases were fun to advertise?
I always found Wilford Brimley irritating. It should have at least a fun, could it get a fun spokesperson? Well, B.B. King for a while, but yeah, they're both dead. So
The B.B. King one was sad to me because diabetes, swelling of the extremities, it's just like this dude can't even play guitar anymore.
yeah.
Beer advertising prior to Prohibition in the United States and basically globally was all focused on quality. We make the best beer because we got the best stuff. We have the highest quality beer because we have the highest quality brewers. Our technologies mean we have the best beer. That was basically it. It was this ad nauseum.
Yeah, it was every company saying basically the same thing. Drink our beer because it's better than the rest of them, because we say so. And sometimes there were little digs in there. We have talked in the last episodes about how adjunct grains, corn and rice, start getting introduced into American beer in about the 1870s. That's really the moment where American beer starts to differentiate from its German roots. American lagers, what we call American lagers, are these, really watery, bastardized versions of a nice German Pilsner that, for the most part, we've added a bunch of either rice or corn to. And that starts in the 1870s, and along with it starts different breweries shit-talking others about whether they're using adjuncts at all. And here in Cincinnati, we were famous for not using adjuncts at all. Milwaukee started using a lot of corn, and St. Louis started using a lot of rice. And none of the, rice and corn won't kill you. But that was this underlying thing that was going on in the late 1800s.
And they don't inherently make worse beer either. Rice and corn have historically and still today are more expensive ingredients than barley malt. So it doesn't mean it's worse, but it was a point of differentiation that they could hammer on.
And it's going to give you a lighter-bodied beer.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
It will give you a lighter-bodied beer.
So those ads were all basically that same theme. And whether they have this little variation, these little digs on rice or corn, it's all about we use great ingredients, we use good processes, we don't put anything bad in our beer, and that's what makes it so delicious, and that's why you should drink it.
And so then when we saw the rise of modern advertising, which really begins with Guinness in 1929 with their first Guinness is Good for You major campaign.
And it is.
And it is quite delicious and quite fortifying. I think it gives me strength, really.
It does. Guinness does give you strength. It only has like 4% alcohol content too. So
it's low calorie as well.
I think I am a doctor. It's a Juris Doctorate, but technically I am a doctor. And I will tell you right now, the Guinness is good for you.
Well, you heard it here, folks. We have Dr. Morgan signing off on Guinness is, in fact, good for you.
Even though that's illegal to say.
Well, this is not health advice. This is not financial advice. But those ads were based off of the ads that we're already seeing in the 1800s and the early 1900s. It's quality. The quality of the beer, the quality of the ingredients, the quality of the brewers and the scientific method that they were implementing. But something changed with Guinness. They switched. They kept the message the same, but they distilled it down into a very simple format. They added bright colors, they added animals, you got the toucan now involved with Guinness, and you had one special phrase that summed up all of that quality talk in 4 simple words. My goodness, my Guinness. It was bright, they were colorful, they were fun, they weren't necessarily talking directly about, we have the best malt, here's 20 different testimonies and scientific studies of the time that show we have the best stuff. They were just simple, concise, to the point ads.
And they were funny. I mean, they were pelicans or whatever with glasses of beer on their beaks and, various zoo animals drinking or stealing Guinness in different ways. And so that was a distinct departure from everything that came before. But it didn't necessarily translate into here in the United States because Guinness didn't start advertising until 1929. They go into this whole my goodness, my Guinness ad campaign in the 1930s, early to mid 30s. So during that period of time, we're still in and or just coming out of Prohibition here in the United States. So Guinness it didn't really translate into what happened with American advertising because we were still going through our own stupid machinations around whether beer should even be legal or not.
In the 1930s, the primary form of advertising for companies to reach their consumers was through print. We're talking magazines, newspapers, billboards. It's your standard print media. But all that changed in the 1940s, and it changed from print to radio.
So when radio becomes a big thing in the 40s, breweries start radio ads. And the messaging is not radically different from what it had been before. It's still drink our beer because it tastes better and it's higher quality. But what they did start to do was pair beer with sports. So this game played by the Cincinnati Reds or this AAA ball league is brought to you by Burger Beer. Burger Beer here regionally was one of the companies that was really at the forefront of sports advertising. But they weren't alone. All across the country, breweries were latching on to sponsorship of sports because, and baseball specifically, beer and baseball had always gone together. Beer actually transformed baseball and turned it into the American pastime. When baseball first started as a popular sport, the games were really expensive to go to, so it was kind of elitist, sort of like it is today.
Mm-hmm.
But it became the national pastime when breweries started to get involved in baseball, and often breweries even owned the teams. And they sold tickets cheaply, and they made their money by selling a boatload of beer. So beer and baseball in particular had always had this symbiotic relationship. So when the 40s roll around and radio is a thing and listening to baseball on the radio is a very popular thing to do, breweries find a natural fit between advertising by sponsoring sports teams.
It's a really genius move from the get-go, finding a thing that attracts the masses, lowering the prices, lowering the barrier of entry so the masses can get involved, and also selling more beer that way, which is the drink of the masses. So you took something that was elitist bourgeoisie bullshit, you brought in these proletariat efforts for it, and then boom, all of a sudden, you not only are you making more money, but it's way more popular and way more people are becoming loyal and hearing about and drinking your beer.
It really kind of doubles down on making beer a working person's drink. And it's also a dual brand loyalty. You're using people's loyalty for their local sports team to help build loyalty for your beer.
It only makes sense on the radio as well, which was already broadcasting the games, to broadcast advertisements for said beer. Because if you're going to sit at home, whittling on your front porch while you're listening to the baseball game, you may as well be enjoying the beer at your house that's supporting the team.
Yeah, absolutely. And, when you think about this history of baseball, if we could speak briefly as a complete side rant to professional baseball, the reason that people don't go to baseball games anymore is not because the game is too slow. I'm fine with the game being a real nice pace, as long as I can sit there and I can enjoy some beers.
I mean, shit, football games are 4 hours long. It's not the pace of the game that's the problem here.
Right, and football stops every 30 seconds to litigate something, right? Yeah, it's not really a pacing thing, I don't think. I think that spending your afternoon in a nice stadium on a beautiful day, watching a game that's paced well, that's entertaining, as long as I can have a few beers without getting a third mortgage on my house.
Exactly. I want to be able to slurp a couple chili dogs, slam a couple beers, maybe leave with a good buzz after 3 to 4 hours of watching baseball and feel good about myself and not having spent $50, $60, $70, $100, $200, let alone ticket pricing.
Yeah, you greedy bastards. It is not. It's not the pace of the game. You don't need to shoot me with a t-shirt cannon. You don't need to put a bunch of crap on the screen. You need to stop raping me at the beer booth. Stop overcharging for tickets and stop overcharging for beers and just let us go back to having a game that ordinary people can afford to go to and enjoy.
It really is a shame that it's the history's right there. The thing that made this popular, the thing that made people come out with their families and spend afternoons was the fact that it was an affordable, fun thing to do. Not something that you could only do once a year because it's going to cost you $500 to take your family.
Right.
It's insane.
Yeah. Back to beer. TV is the thing that changes everything.
And there was 2 major waves of television advertising in regards to beer. The first wave from 1950 to 1964, there was a little bit of a lull between 64 and 74, and then we have this second wave, the renaissance of beer ads in the 70s, 80s, into the 90s, where things really ramped up in regards to national advertising, which we'll get to.
And that second wave of really frenetic spending is specifically like 74 to 86. So those two periods, it's not like beer advertising stopped in between or it stopped after that. It's just that was these two periods that economists have taken a look at and seen the advertising dollars increase exponentially. And we can also directly link what happened to the brewing industry to these two waves of advertising. We can look at all the money going into advertising and we can compare it to what was going on with the number of breweries and what was selling and say, oh my God, advertising pretty much by itself dramatically changed what the American brewing industry looked like and what type of beer we drank.
Yeah, and it's not often that it's as easy to tease out causation versus correlation. But it's pretty stark. There's other cultural things happening in the U.S., obviously, but it's pretty stark, the shift in big beer versus regional beer versus local beer, the changes compared to the spending on advertising, and how the spending on advertising increasing is causing decreases in the breweries that are not having that same spend in television advertising.
Yeah, I mean, to break that down, and I don't want to read a lot of numbers to people, but I find these numbers really fascinating for perspective. You know, when we're in 1950, when this first really big funding of advertising starts, there's about 380 breweries nationwide. So we'd already dropped from about 750 to 380 between 1934 and 1950. But what's really crazy about that period of time is that 70% of the U.S. beer market was being filled by small regional breweries. You know, your small mom and pop small business brewery, kind of the equivalent of craft breweries today, they were 70% of the market. Large regional breweries were 11% of the market. And the big three, which were Anheuser-Busch, of course, and the other two,
Schlitz and Pabst.
Schlitz and Pabst. Probably not the ones a lot of people would suspect these days. So Anheuser-Busch, Schlitz, and Pabst are only 18% of the market, which is a lot for three breweries. But compared to modern times, when you think about the biggest of big beer only being 18% of the market and the smallest breweries being 70% of the market, that's friggin' crazy.
You know what's nuts is those exact percentages are flipped in modern times. Literally the exact percentages. Big beer is 70% of the damn market this day and age. Craft breweries are 20% of the market. And the in-between is the large regionals, which have always kind of stayed steady around that 15% mark. 100% flip.
Yeah.
Can you imagine?
And why did it happen?
Because television advertising.
Because television advertising.
Can you imagine a world if it was still 70% craft breweries? If every single neighborhood had multiple breweries on the corner like you would a bar? Oh my God, what a world.
It would be great, and it could be our future. I mean, AB InBev may help make that our future because they actually appear to be pretty bad at selling beer. If you look at Budweiser sales, I mean, Budweiser was the king of beers from about 1876 until around about when AB InBev bought it and started screwing it up. So maybe those really big behemoth breweries will greed their way into giving us that back, but
we can only hope.
I don't know. We can only hope. It's Friday, man. Let's have a little cheer and hope for a brighter future.
No more piss in a bottle is what I always say. The ads in the 1950s were interesting in the U.S. though. They used a lot of humor. They used cartoon bears.
Very safe humor. Yes. Cartoon bears.
Yes.
Hams. Yeah.
Yeah, cartoon bears if you were hams. They focused a little bit on the quality and the care put into making it. I mean, we're seeing a lot of what was happening in the 1800s or early 1900s just now being pushed onto the television screen. What's interesting is you have this cartoon bear that hams used. We didn't have the same advertising protections in the U.S. yet when this first started. You could still make vague health claims legally. You could use cartoon bears that just
really attractive to kids.
Yes. You could go after customers in ways that there were no protections for.
We'll also talk about that more later with Anheuser-Busch, but sort of like with cigarettes, if we're going to really pull the curtain back and talk truth about the brewing industry has understood for a long time the same thing that cigarette companies understood,
Mm-hmm.
which is brand loyalty gets built at young ages. Brand loyalty occurs and locks in before you're legal to use the product. So it's not coincidental that they use advertising that's
Mm-hmm.
appealing to, teenagers or even children. It is planning. They're not necessarily trying to sell beer to 8-year-olds, but they're planting that seed. They're trying to create visual images as far back as the 50s that are going to stick with you from youth and give you an affection for that product.
We also saw in the 1950s the initial uh, regional beer spats. As you were talking about earlier, we had Anheuser-Busch criticizing Pabst for using corn. We had Cincinnati breweries criticizing AB for using rice. We had Milwaukee breweries, i.e. Pabst, criticizing breweries for using corn, or because Cincinnati beer was just using barley and hops and yeast, keeping Reinheitsgebot, criticizing them for being old-fashioned. We had this roundabout three-way battle going on that helped these regionals get this huge market share increase that we saw between 1950 to 1964.
Yeah, local brand loyalty.
Yes.
And also in this period of time, 50s and 60s, the brewing industry was heavily unionized. So it was good jobs, and you had a lot of loyalty to these brands because a lot of these brands, a lot of these breweries, they employed people in your community and they employed them with good jobs. So these small regional and even more than that, large regional, because they would have tended to pay better, large regional breweries had really strong loyalty. Large regionals also were the real winner in this first advertising wave between 50 and 64.
We saw a shrinking of the small, local, tiny breweries. We saw an increased market share grab of the regional breweries, and the national breweries largely stayed the same. In part because the regional breweries were able to capitalize on television ads, the first television ads in the 1950s through 1964. They were able to gobble up the local market share in their region from all these smaller local breweries that couldn't afford to advertise on television. And the national breweries weren't yet in a spot to capitalize on a national level better than the regional breweries were able to capitalize in their region.
When you look at that television advertising from that era, the difference between a large regional brewery's ad and a huge brewery's ad are not really different in quality of the ad itself. I mean, Ham's ads were every bit as good as an Anheuser-Busch ad. The Anheuser-Busch ad is going to run across the country, but you in your living room, who cares?
And you have the added benefit, if you're Hams, of the people in your market are way more loyal to Hams because they know people that work at the brewery. They know it's a good paying job and they care about their local area.
And you only have to spend money in the target areas where you're doing your distribution. This is more cost effective.
And what ended up happening is we saw a shrinking of the total number of breweries over that period. Over that 14-year period, we went from 380 breweries down to 140 breweries in the United States. And those breweries that closed were all the small, tiniest neighborhood breweries, city breweries, not the regionals, not the nationals.
This is a huge kill off of the smallest mom and pop breweries.
140 breweries is nothing, too, by the way. This is such a small amount of breweries. For comparison, we're at 9,600 or so in the U.S. today, with another 1,000 plus in planning still to open. So if you live in any town that's bigger than 10,000 people, you probably have a brewery in your town. And when you're talking 140 breweries in 1964, you'd be lucky to even see a brewery at any point in your life.
Yeah, they were becoming a rarity across the country. And in fact, by the time, we go into this lull where the industry kind of stabilizes for the most part for a few years and ad spending stabilizes. It doesn't stop. It just doesn't have these big waves. By the time we reached 1968, the 10 biggest breweries in the United States controlled 66% of the market. Now, again, compared to today, what the 3 largest international breweries control, that's still modest. That's quaint. But when we're talking about not only the small breweries being extinct, going extinct, but the large regionals, some of those large regionals really starting to pull ahead. It's not like they're taking that additional market share evenly. Some of them are really starting to become winners in that period. So the 3 biggest plus the rest of that collection of 10 biggest breweries, they're 66% of the market. And at 66% of the market, there are economists that will tell you you have basically killed off the concept of meritocracy at that point.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that I can succeed in the brewing business by opening a brewery and making a better beer than other people make, that is a fun, cute, childish little idea you have, dummy. You can't. When there is that much of the market concentrated in that few companies, anything those companies do can manipulate the market.
Well, if you want to look at it at the micro scale, just look at the struggles in the 1970s that Jack McAuliffe went through to open a brewery. There was no meritocracy. There was no infrastructure for it. He went to the government, and the government's like, what the hell are you talking about? You can't open a brewery. What? What does that mean? Breweries are huge factories, and there's 10 of them. You're not one of those.
Why don't you open a rocket to the moon factory, you dumbass?
Oh, no wonder Elon's so stupid.
Why don't you make your rocket look like a dick? Yeah, but, Jack McAuliffe didn't have Elon Musk kind of money.
No,
either.
He barely had living money, let alone brewery money. And it showed. And the difficulty in getting going, the difficulty that we addressed in season 1 of just getting breweries going in the 70s and 80s was a direct result of this monopoly to the highest 10 breweries in the country.
With the real concentration starting to go more and more to the top 3, but that hadn't quite happened yet. But by the time you're in the early 1970s, breweries really have 4 basic options.
Existing breweries.
They can either expand their capacity internally. It's what Anheuser-Busch and Schlitz and Pabst, I seem to have a lot of trouble saying Schlitz. It's what Anheuser-Busch and Schlitz and Pabst started to do. I have even a harder time drinking Schlitz these days, but we'll get to that later. But they can either expand the way those breweries did by building additional plants in additional places, or they could merge with other breweries and expand that way. But that was difficult because in the 1890s, we established anti-monopoly laws in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And until the 1970s, we actually gave a shit about those laws. People in Washington actually enforced them. Now, that became passé, and we'll also talk about that later. But it was hard. It was a lot harder to merge or buy other breweries because you couldn't take over too much of a percentage of a market or the federal government would file suit against you. So you could do that, but that was limited. Your third option, if you didn't have the capacity to get a lot bigger, you could find a niche market. And an example of that here regionally is Little Kings.
Mm-hmm.
Little Kings, if people have never had it, but a lot of you have or have seen it, because Little Kings throughout most of the past, 30 or 40 years, maybe longer, has had something like a 26, 28 state distribution. And it got that because it's in these little 8-ounce green bottles, and it's a cream ale. The beer was made, it's in those little bottles actually, because it was originally made to be a chaser for bourbon. It was meant to accompany a Boilermaker,
Mm-hmm.
so you didn't have to pour a full beer. You just had this little beer, and it's a cream ale, so there's sugar added to the mash, and it's a little bit sweeter,
And
and
it's
it
a cute as
pairs.
shit little bottle.
It
I
is
mean,
a
like,
cute as
it's
shit little
cute.
bottle. Yeah,
It's
yeah.
fun. You crush it, and it doesn't
Yes.
get warm by the time you're done because it's 4 gulps.
Right, right. It may also be great to throw at road signs. I don't, I don't you'd have to shamefully ask my 16-year-old self. But you could find a niche like that, and it was pretty limited, but by the time you get into the very early 80s, that could be making better beer. It could be starting to get into craft, and there was just a few breweries across the United States that started to make that move. But what your niche could also be like malt liquor,
Mm-hmm.
and major breweries did that, Schlitz in particular. But you could find those little things that had their own specific little market.
And the beauty of the niche markets was that you had some of the best brand loyalty, product loyalty, category loyalty of any of the others. Anheuser-Busch, Schlitz, Pabst, I mean, at the time, yes, they had strong brand loyalty, and there's probably people who are diehard. I'm not drinking Schlitz ever. I'm only a Pabst guy. But for the people who weren't drinking a case a week, it's probably pretty interchangeable. But if you have Little Kings and you love Little Kings and Little Kings is your thing, you can't just go down to the store and find a different Little Kings. There's no comparable replacement. And the same thing largely when malt liquor was first getting onto the scene. It has very strong niche loyalty, and that's the beauty of the niche market, is you can fill that niche, own that niche, and create very loyal customers. And your other option, besides those 3, is
Die. Just die in the cold. Starve, file bankruptcy, go live behind a dumpster. That's your 4th choice.
which was a very real choice for a lot of these breweries. I mean,
Yeah.
you don't have consolidation like that unless that's happening. It's not all just buy-ups. You don't go from 750 breweries down to 140 because it's all emerging. It's, no, I'm eating your lunch because I'm advertising, stealing your market share, and then I'm not just sitting on that money, I'm reinvesting it in growing my capacity, opening up new breweries, and continuing to dominate markets and expand where I'm going deep.
Yeah. And when we say that choice, really, there's not a lot of people that wake up on a Wednesday and say, I'm going to choose to tank the family business. It was more that they didn't get the memo. They were financially incapable of
Yes.
any form of expansion, and they didn't see the need to find a niche, or they didn't find it. They just kept plugging along thinking, business is going to get better again. We make fine beer. We've been making fine beer. We've been doing great since my grandfather. Everything's going to be cool. And it wasn't.
Yeah, and it's hard to make those advertisement spends when you're a small brewery and you're basically just making enough to pay your employees, to keep the lights on, and to live a modest life. There's not a lot of extra cash sitting around that you can be investing in TV ad spots. And if you could, let's say you buy a single TV ad spot, that's not going to do it for you.
No.
In the advertising world, the old cliche is it takes someone 10 times seeing your brand for it to click and stick in their brain when they go to make a purchase decision and they see your brand for that 11th time on the store shelf, then they buy it. So they got to see your brand 10 times prior to that. You do one TV ad spot or you have one billboard, you're not getting 10 exposures, you're getting 1.
Yeah.
Which means
it doesn't pay off. It's not cost effective.
And who could have seen at the time that these breweries would have put the connection together of, hey, like Anheuser-Busch, well, I'm doing really well in my region, but if I'm selling beer in Florida, I'm not making as good as profit margin, and I want to increase my Florida reach, I need to open a new plant in Florida. Well, I have the same issue in New Jersey. Now I have the same issue in California. Getting over the Rockies is a bitch. I need to get a plant over there. So you had these big breweries that were investing this money, this additional market share that they were making into making new plants.
Yeah, and that what you described is exactly what Anheuser-Busch did. They opened a plant in New Jersey, California, and Florida, in addition to the one they had in St. Louis. So they're making beer strategically all over the country. And these new plants are more effective, more efficient,
Hmm.
more productive. So they're making beer, per beer or per barrel, they're making their beer cheaper just through efficiency, not even with cost cutting yet, just through efficiency in the process. They're making their beer cheaper than a small or even a large regional brewery can make it per barrel.
And there was still a lot of pride in these breweries because they were American and they supported America and they loved the communities that they're in and they were paying people better. They were union facility plants. They had a lot of jobs. So if Anheuser-Busch was opening up in a new city, they were investing not only in the brewery itself and trying to grab more market share, but they were investing in the communities in ways that your local brewery couldn't do as well. They were investing in the people. They were investing in making roads nicer or having parks built or whatever, bush gardens for God's sakes, which we'll get to later. All of these things came because they could and because they knew that if you build loyalty by building community, buying community essentially, you're going to squeeze out these small breweries that don't have that same buying power and luxury.
Yeah, so this is when consolidation really starts to get crazy. And it's also when advertising really starts to get crazy. But if you just look at expansion between 1970 and 1979, Anheuser-Busch increased its capacity 100%. Miller, that we haven't talked about yet because they weren't relevant until this period of time, Miller increased their capacity by 500%. And Schlitz, that had been in the number 2 spot, neck and neck with Anheuser-Busch as the second best-selling beer in America, they increased their capacity by 80%.
And those numbers might like, oh, 100%. What? That doesn't seem like that much. No. We're talking like 2 million barrels up to 4 million barrels.
Yeah.
We're talking absolutely massive jumps in scale and quantities over a decade period.
It's game-changing in the industry. And there's a lot of crazy things that start to happen into the 70s. And we're going to start exploring them a little bit more in the next episode. But to tee those up a little bit, some of the crazy stuff that happened in the 70s, Schlitz goes from being the darling of Wall Street and the number 2 selling beer in the United States on the verge of becoming number 1 to falling completely off a cliff and becoming a joke and a budget brand in a 2-year period of time is a crazy, fascinating business story. And we're going to get to that in a subsequent episode. And Miller becomes the second biggest brewery in the United States, up from obscurity as a result of massive amounts of corporate funding.
It's really a crazy time in beer. When you have successfully eliminated all of the low-hanging fruit and competition that was smaller breweries that eventually became the regional breweries and picking them off, the only thing that's left is the top dogs to fight each other. And so you see this, the calm before the storm is what happened in 1964 through 1974. TV ad spending decreased a little bit, it leveled off because they successfully eliminated the lower level competition. Things were good. They're making a lot more money, they're opening all these new plants, they're making these internal investments. They don't necessarily need to go out and try to scratch and claw at growth yet because they're still spending money. That return on investment is it's on the horizon. So you have these breweries and they're sitting comfortable. And things are changing. The machinations that are happening behind the scenes politically, the machinations that are happening with these breweries, the shakeups that you're talking about with Schlitz and Miller, all of this is starting to lead into what became the second wave of advertising in the mid-70s.
And what we called the beer wars in the 1970s. And what happens in the mid-70s when we see this big uptick and we see radical shifts is also the introduction of light beer. And that becomes a game changer. But along with that, Miller really invents modern American beer advertising in the mid-1970s, and it changes absolutely everything.
And let it be said that light beer is not a brewing innovation. It is the premier marketing innovation in beer.
Yeah, it existed. I have seen an ad for Heron Court, was a brewery here in Cincinnati that went out of business in Prohibition. And I have seen an early 1900s ad for Heron Court Light. It had been around, and they'd been making light beer. They just called it diet beer in Germany. It had existed for forever. So when we say light beer is invented or light beer is introduced, that's not accurate. The real innovation, the only innovation in light beer was advertising. And it's what made light beer from something that had never previously sold to what's now the number one and number two best-selling beer in the United States.
So to summarize what happened post-Prohibition up to about 1974 is we had radio advertising and sports with beer becoming further entrenched. Sports and beer to this day go hand in hand. So this was just radio furthered that, and we still see it. In the 1950s, with television advertising coming on board, we saw large spend by large regionals and national breweries, which led to small local breweries basically being completely destroyed and going extinct. At this point in time, we're sitting really top-heavy with our national brands and our regional brands, and things are pretty calm. But we've laid the foundation for two very important things to come. One, which is what we've been going on in larger detail in our season 1 and will continue in season 2 and 3, is craft beer. The birth of craft beer, the foundation has now been laid for that to come. It has been successfully eliminated, and it is only natural that it's going to come back. The second thing, which we're going to explore next episode of this season 1.5, is the coming beer wars. And that is going to be a fun episode. We also have the Schlitz story that we're going to squeeze in there in between too, which that's
is
a doozy.
Fun in a sad, tragic kind of way. And we will not be drinking Schlitz for that.
No.
And neither will you. Guess what? It's a hell of a story. I can't wait to get to the next part of it. And I hope people are digging it. I found this history fascinating as hell. I hope everybody else does too.
Same. Let's go to church.
Cheers.
Cheers.
The Brew Skies Happy Hour podcast is a production of Brew Skies Limited in association with 779, a leading video production and content creation agency. With over a decade of experience, 779 works with a wide range of clients, from global brands to boutique startups to mom-and-pop shops. Visit 779video.com for more information. That's the numbers 779video.com. This episode was edited by Dan Fennessy, who is also our executive producer. This podcast was engineered by Adam Rabinowitz. Thanks for listening.